You are watching GrassRoots Television, serving the Roaring Fork Valley since 1971.
Hello, I'm Tom Egan, and we are doing an interview for the Roaring Fork Valley Veterans History Project. We're at the GrassRoots TV studios in downtown Aspen, and today it's my pleasure to interview a couple of ladies from the WASP program. We've got Ruth Brown and Betty Pfister. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, before we get into stories and finding out more about your service in the military, can we get some background information? So Ruth, can we start with you? Maybe tell us where and when you were born, maybe where you went to school, some biographical background information.
I was born in Denver and went to school in the start of Grayland, which I'm sure you've heard of Grayland.
And where is that?
In Denver.
That's in
elementary
Denver, yeah.
School, yeah.
Oh, okay, the elementary.
And then I went to, after Grayland, I went to Kent for a couple of years, and then I went east to school.
And where did you go to school in the east?
To Miss Porter's at Farmington, Connecticut.
Great. And Betty?
Excuse me. I was born in New York and went to school there until about 8th grade or 9th grade, I guess. I went to boarding school in Pennsylvania.
And are there any particular memories of your childhood? Did you have large families, small families? Give us a little more background, because as we get into talking about flying, I suspect some of that is going to affect why you ended up becoming pilots. Did you have a large family?
Not particularly, no. I just had one sister.
Mm-hmm.
And a mother and a father that both have passed away now, but they lived for quite a while. My growing up stages. And did you want to know why I was thinking when it got into flying?
Sure.
Well, my family had one of the first private airplanes that flew around this country. They had a pilot and just a pleasure plane.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was, as a little girl, I was sort of having to go with them, and I really didn't like it at all. Every time they tell me that I had to go on the flight, I'd say, no, I don't really want to go, but they made me go. So I went, and so later on in the years, having flown so much with them as a passenger in the rear of the airplane, I wanted to do something for the war effort, which we had gotten into at that point. And rather than netting for bundles for Britain, I decided with the flying background that I had that I'd get into flying, and that's when the WASPs, that's how I got into the WASPs.
When did you get your license, pilot's license?
Training with the WASPs,
Mm-hmm.
which was in I'm terrible on dates, but 1939, I guess it was.
Mm-hmm. And just to backtrack a little bit, your family has a history in Denver that a lot of people may be familiar with the name Brown. Your grandfather was prominent in Denver.
Well, my name wasn't Brown. That's my married name.
Uh-huh.
My name was Humphreys.
Okay.
And my grandfather was Colonel Humphreys, and then also Charles Betcher, who you probably have heard of.
Mm-hmm. And then, Betty, when did you learn to fly and get your pilot's license?
Well,
And why?
I learned to fly because my brother had started flying, and he ended up being a Navy pilot. He was at Yale, and as Ruthie said, the war was on, and a lot of people were changing their plans because of that, and he got in the Navy, dropped out of Yale after 2 years and became a Navy pilot. And I was sort of a copycat. He was only a year older, and I liked to do the same things he did. And I think curiosity more than anything, I started flying. And then I got the telegram from Jackie Cochran asking if I'd be interested in the WASP program. And I sent a return telegram about as fast as it was possible. That was the beginning for me.
And when was that?
That was 1943.
And
I was at college at the time, and I accelerated my college program so I could get out early.
where were you in college?
Bennington College in Vermont.
I almost went there. Now, how would someone know to get in touch with you specifically about that? Was there
Jackie Cochran, there was a I don't know who keeps records, but they were keeping records in Washington of all the women that had pilot licenses, and Jackie Cochran got those records. And I don't know if you got a telegram from Jackie asking
No.
if you knew about the WASP and then aimed for that, or? See, mine was a little different. I'd never heard of the WASP, and Jackie sent these telegrams to, I was a couple of months earlier, I think, than you were, and that was what they were doing, as I remember.
Right.
I don't remember applying. I remember her asking if I was interested. My whole class was a little close to the beginning of the program.
Now, can you give us some sense of what it was like to be a woman in the military at that time? I think nowadays, this is 2008, it's much more common, but what I read is it wasn't particularly common, and it was something brand new as opposed to the previous history where women were generally nurses. You had the WAC and the WASP program. What was the atmosphere like being women pilots in a military effort? Did you feel welcome? Did you feel like you were really helping, or was there some emotional detachment that you felt? What was the atmosphere like? Betty?
It was
Or Ruth?
It was good as far as I was concerned. The military bases that I happened to be stationed at were very accepting of the women pilots. In fact, we usually made the male pilots a little jealous because they usually gave us a free whatever you want to say. They were glad to have us aboard, and as far as the flying was concerned, they favored us over the male pilots. Why, I don't know, but they did.
What was your impression of that time, being a woman in the military?
Well, I started out in the WASP in the Ferry Command after I'd graduated from training, and went to a base that had a very large contingent of WASPs there. So it wasn't as though we were breaking trail. They were already accepted at that base in Wilmington, Delaware. And I went from there to Palm Springs, where we were welcomed with open arms. And they couldn't have treated us any better. And then I ended up, the last few months before the WASP were deactivated, I ended up in Arizona at a field, there were only 8 of us, testing airplanes. The male cadets had cracked up. And the commanding officer there did not like WASPs at all, so that was my experience.
Now, how long were each of you in the program? Ruth?
In the WASP
In the WASP program?
Well, we were in, what was it, a couple of years for training, wasn't it?
No, about 8 months for training, and I think about the ones at the very beginning until we all were let go the same day, no matter what job or what base we were at. December 20th, 1944, the program was finished. And we had started at different times. I think the beginning of 1943, I think, was the first WASP class. That's all I can remember. I was in the 4th class.
And what rank did you have, and what branch of the military were you considered a part of?
We had no rank. It was all just on a level keel. And we were not really in the military. We were in a very strange position. We were civilians on military status, I think they called us. And we were given certain military privileges we could use. In fact, they encouraged using the officers' club. They encouraged dating officers. We supposedly couldn't date enlisted men because we were going to be officers. Some of the ladies married enlisted men, and you wondered how they got to know each other well enough to marry them.
In that time of being in the WASP program, and I should mention WASP is Women's Air Force Service Pilots, is that correct?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you both had an interest in flying beforehand. It's been said that the male pilots came in as regular men, if you will, and became pilots. You almost had to be a pilot, or at least on your way to becoming a pilot, to be asked to be a WASP, and your experience with the Jackie Cochran telegram would indicate that. Did you feel like perhaps when you started, you were maybe a step ahead of most of the male pilots who were coming in, or the male enlistees, if you will, who didn't know how to fly? Did you feel a little special?
I don't think, I didn't.
No, I didn't.
Just very happy to be flying the military planes and getting the training they gave us. They gave us identical training that the men had, excepting there was no bombing training. Well, that's wrong. They did do some bombing practice, I guess. I didn't. But
Well, I was at a bombardier school.
yeah.
So we had bombing training
And where was that? Where were you?
in Childress, Texas.
Childress, Texas. And were you there for the
spent
entire
my-
time, or?
Spent my whole life with the WASP practically in Texas.
And what was the name of the base?
Childress, Army Air
that
Force.
was the name of it?
Yeah.
And Betty, you actually moved around a bit. You said you were back east, in California, then Arizona.
Yes.
And how long would you be at each one?
There was no set time. I can't remember how long I was in Wilmington. And I had selected Wilmington as my first choice because you didn't always get your first choice, but we were allowed to at least specify because it was nearest to New York. I think there were 4 Ferry Command fields at the time. I know they had Romulus, Michigan, and Dallas, Texas. A lot of Texas bases, I know that.
Yeah, there were.
Same with the men, I believe. Now, after you enlisted, did you know what you were going to be doing, or was it somewhat nebulous at that point? And what eventually did you end up doing mostly? Ruth? Were you told beforehand, or?
No. I wasn't told beforehand. You enlisted in first of all, to be able to enlist in the WASPs, in the flying end, you had to have so many hours of flight logged, and which I hadn't had. I'd had a lot of hours with my family in that airplane I told you about, but that was just as a passenger. So I had to have, as a pilot, a certain amount of hours. So I went to a base in Texas. No, actually, as a matter of fact, I did this in Denver, Colorado, where I was born. And I picked up I think you had to have 35 hours of log flying time to be able to enlist in the WASPs. And so after that, you had no idea, once you were accepted, as to where they were going to send you. They just put you where they needed you.
Did you think you might end up in combat, or was that always?
No, that was usually not.
That was never a possibility.
Never a possibility.
So,
Unless the war changed in any dramatic effect where they really had to send the women overseas.
But they had a lot of, the men were overseas and they needed people to replace the men's job.
Right.
I was in the Ferry Command, which we all thought was the prime. I still think, looking back today, it was the best fun place a WASP could have because we got to fly many different types of
Yeah,
airplanes.
you really did have.
Many more. Other than that, people, the WASP were more like Ruth. I think the majority were at training bases
Right,
and in the training command, and they would fly one type aircraft where
exactly.
we got to fly lots of different ones.
And where would you be ferrying these planes from, and where would you be taking them?
Well, we took them all over the United States. There's a great feeling that the WASP flew overseas and flew over the Atlantic, which we never did. 25, I think, American women flew in England with the English women, but they didn't go back and forth across the ocean. The WASP never did overseas. They were going to at one point. There was a possibility, but it never happened.
So it was within the country, ferrying planes from...
We were about 300 of us, I think, in the ferry command, something like that. I remember some figures, if you want them. 25,000 women applied when the program was finished, and 2,000 had been accepted for training, and 1,000 graduated. And 38 were killed in the 2 years that the program was in place.
And you were one of the 1,000. You were both one of the
Yeah, lucky ones.
lucky 1,000, if you will. And what was your position in the WASP? If you weren't in the ferry program, what would you be doing, Ruth?
Well, I was in what they called the training command instead of the ferry command. Mm-hmm. And that was being sent to bases where you were helping the flying there was done for training. Like I was at the bombardier school, and we were training bombardiers. And then I went to a gunnery school, and we were training the gunners, towing targets for the gunners.
Was there any feeling maybe amongst either of you or in the WASP program itself that you really wanted to be a part of the front line, that you were helping everything, and then right when you get to the point where you could go, they say, no, you can't go? Was there ever a feeling you were training and you felt maybe you should be the ones going into combat, or was there ever that in the WASP, or were you happy to be where you were?
I was happy to be where I was.
Mm-hmm. Was there ever a feeling, or did you ever get a feeling from the male pilots of I don't know if the right word is jealousy, or if they were envious of your position, or even the pilots you trained were good for you, good to you?
Well, I didn't train any pilots, so
Mm-hmm.
I was on the receiving end of all the training at different types of aircraft, and once I checked out on a certain plane, then I was eligible and requested to fly them all over the place.
Now, Ruth, if you were actually helping train the gunners and the bombardiers, was there ever a feeling that you knew more than they did, and why aren't I the one going over? And did they ever feel?
I had no desire to go over,
Mm-hmm.
actually. I was happy to be there, what I was doing.
Now, were your expectations met when you joined the WASP? Was it a fulfilling experience, or were there parts of it that you felt?
No, I thought it was very fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel it was fulfilling,
yeah.
Betty? Yeah.
And can you describe what a day would be like as a WASP? Because we get that daily description from the men, and this would be a unique perspective. What was a normal day for you like in the WASP?
The crack of dawn, or whatever it is, with the bugle sounding off,
Mm-hmm.
and you're in a barracks, and you march to breakfast, and then the training began, which a lot of it was ground school, and then you started training, of course, in the airplanes.
And how long was a day in the military back then?
What would you say, Betty?
Probably 6 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. But I mean, 10 would be after dinner. You had time to do some ground school. It's like doing homework, but there's a lot of training going on.
Was it similar to how the men trained?
Almost identical, except not the. We had the same program the men cadets had, except we didn't have any bombing. We were not doing You were training bombardiers, but
Yeah.
you were not training yourself to be one.
No, exactly.
And you might want to tell a little bit about towing targets, because I think that was a pretty hairy job.
It sounds exciting.
Well, it never bothered me, the idea. People nowadays, or ask the question, did you ever feel that you were going to be hit by the training, the target training? But I never did. You told a thing way back of you that,
How far back would you say?
oh Lord, I have no idea exactly, but quite far back.
Mm-hmm.
But you were training some brand new gunners too, and some of the gunners weren't very good at that point. And I know some of the women in the tow target squadron said they came back with a couple of holes in the tail of the T6s or whatever.
Now, just quickly, that reminds me, you mentioned that 38 WASP were killed in the program. What would generally be the reason that would happen? Would it be target practice, do you think, or was it
No,
just...
that was never because of
No.
target
Never
practice.
because of that?
But sometimes they were, I would think, caused by bad weather, and WASP either didn't land soon enough and got themselves in weather they couldn't handle, or
I think that's right.
sometimes there was an unfamiliarity or a defect with the airplane. There was even talk about sabotage in a few places.
What was the most exciting flight that you had in that time? There must have been one or two where things weren't going exactly as planned. Ruth? Or were they all pretty standard flights, no problems?
Mine were all fairly standard, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Did you have any close calls or experiences where you get up and the plane isn't doing what you want it to do? Or
I had one and one only. It ended up with a major crash of the aircraft. My co-pilot and I were not. My first solo, twin-engine solo, we ended up losing both engines, and it got very quiet up there.
Oh,
And that was my only.
what happened?
Well, what happened was that our instructor, we only had about 4 or 5 hours in that type equipment, and my instructor had sent us out to take turns flying without him in the airplane. We had just very minimal, which I think was not a good idea in retrospect. I think we could have had a little more, but it probably wouldn't have helped this particular accident. It's kind of a long story. I don't know if you... Well, what happened was that the planes were all lined up on the flight line. This was in Sweetwater, Texas, in advanced training. And they were all lined up to be refueled. And they had these, I guess, fairly inexperienced young men that were driving the fuel truck. And they would fuel maybe, I don't know, 10 to 15 planes, and the big truck was empty and went back and got refilled. And when they got to the plane that I was going to fly, instead, which was, let's just pretend, number 8 on the truck filling, they should have started with number 8, and they started with number 9, and number 8 never got filled. But we had bad fuel gauges, and our instructor had always told us it's called sticking the fuel tank. You take the cap off and put a piece of wood or metal or something in there and get a reading. But he never did it himself, and he didn't insist we do, but it was protocol to do it. So anyway, our gauges looked fine, and he slapped us on the back and said, "Go solo." And I was the first one. We kind of drew a straw in the left seat. And after I'd flown about 5 or 10 minutes, I can't remember all the details, an engine quit, and he had said, "Now don't pull engines on each other," because we weren't good enough at that point to handle a single engine. And I still remember my co-pilot's name. Some things are never going to forget. Her name was Virginia Wilson, and she was a good friend of mine, and she was in the right seat.
Which is the co-pilot seat.
Co-pilot seat. And after we'd been flying 5 or 10 minutes, all of a sudden, I don't know which engine, one of them quit. And I was furious at Ginny, because this was a little scary for both of us. And I looked at her and started to say, "What did you do?" I mean, I could see she hadn't moved her hand to pull the mixture or do something. And she was white as a sheet, and I said, "Oh my God, you didn't do anything. We've really lost an engine." And so I turned around as fast as I could to head back to Sweetwater on one engine. And both of us hoping we could make it. It was kind of, and it flew very well on one engine. We got it trimmed up and there was no problem. We were quite happy with everything. And I still remember, though, the tower was upset when we called in and said we had lost an engine and we wanted priority, because they had had 2 WASP and an instructor killed the day before, so everybody was pretty nervous and on edge in general. But anyway, the second engine quit just before we were assured of making the airport. And I remember it was going to be a question of whether we were going to stall in, and that would be pretty bad, or could we make it? And I think I got really lucky, because we made it without a scratch on ourselves. The plane was totaled, so we hit pretty hard, but in a level position.
What kind of plane was that?
It was called a useless Cessna, UC-78, a useless Cessna.
And was that a plane that you flew much after that?
Never flew one again that I remember, but it was part of standard basic. Did you have that for basic training?
Yeah.
For your twin engine part?
Twin engine, yeah, AT-11s.
We had the UC-78.
Did you use a fuel stick every time after that?
Never used one again, because...
Really?
And then they had an inquest, I guess it was an inquest. Anytime a plane had that much damage, or if anyone was hurt, which we weren't. Oh, but they panicked because the flight surgeon, who was on duty all the time, had just arrived at the field about a week before. They'd had a change. And I remember he was there when the 2 WASP were killed. And then suddenly, the next day or a couple of days later, we put on our act. And so I think it was harder on him than anyone.
How soon after that were you flying again?
Oh, the next day they made us take a thorough exam, and as I say, we literally didn't need a Band-Aid. Luckily we just got in nice and smoothly. I was very lucky.
What was it like mentally going up the next day?
No problem.
Really? That's impressive. I think I would have had a trouble with that. Do you know how many hours you flew while you were in the WASP program? Or how many missions? Did you call them missions?
We didn't call them missions.
No.
Well, what did you call it? Just a
Just
flights, just
day at the
hours.
office?
hours in the logbook.
Mm-hmm. How many hours did you end up with? Do you remember?
I had around 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
I did too.
That pretty?
800, I think, for me, something like that.
And that would be pretty standard, you think?
There was no such thing as a standard. It just totally depended on the job you were doing.
Do you think you flew more or less than the average WASP?
I have no idea.
No idea. Now, we talked about the flying. Some of the people, are there specific people you remember from that era that stick in your mind? You mentioned Virginia Wilson, I believe. Were there others that stick in your mind, and why would they? Ruth? People from that era? Maybe a commander or...
Did you have a favorite instructor? I did. I can't remember.
You did?
Yeah.
I can't remember who I had. But you talking about remembering like instructors or
Well, just anyone who sticks out in your mind from that experience.
or somebody training with you?
Yeah, any of the above.
Yeah. Well, I think of some of the gals that I knew well stick in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a Sammy Chapin and
Exactly.
those
Ellie Folk.
Ellie folk. Of course, I knew Ellie before.
That's true.
You both knew these?
No, we had
Women or-
different friends. I happened to know Sammy, but mostly from after the WASP. I think. I met her after the WASP.
Did you know each other in the WASP program?
No, because you had to train at the same time that
In the same class, and
In
I
the
was
same
a couple of months
class.
ahead of Ruth.
Oh, okay. Now the other area of being a WASP that we like to fill in if we can is downtime. What did you do at downtime or leave, or when we talk to a number of the men, there's always it seems like there were pranks and jokes and stories about getting in trouble and that sort of thing. Was the WASP program filled with that sort of thing too, or were you maybe a little more sedate? And how would you describe your downtime? Time off.
We didn't have very much.
I was just going to say the same thing.
What was time off? We had very little.
We had very little time off.
Mm-hmm. Were you working 7 days a week?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
For the entire 2 years or year and 8 months, whatever it was?
Right.
When you did go out for entertainment, what would you do?
Well, we might maybe go to the movies, or once I remember going to Sweetwater Lake and just kind of have a chance to swim and relax a little bit. There was very little time off.
That's true.
Were you relieved when December 20th, 1944 came about?
But we were all extremely upset.
Really?
We wanted to keep going. Some of the WASPs even offered to do it for free. And
they got rid of us right away.
What was the reason? Since you
they
had
said
apparently...
we were taking the jobs of men who were now back from overseas, and they thought we were taking jobs that the men needed.
How did that make you feel?
Well, we didn't think that was the case. They still had a lot of planes that needed to be ferried. I don't know about the training command, how that...
Because that was after D-Day, which would be about 60 years ago tomorrow, 64 years ago tomorrow. Did that have something to do? Was the war beginning to wind down then?
Absolutely.
I mean, for people who don't know...
That was given as the reason for the closing down of the whole WASP program. But they'd invested a lot of money in us as far as our training went. And
now, you had said that you were essentially civilians with military
status.
Did that make you eligible for the GI Bill and all of the benefits?
No, we weren't
after?
until 1973, I think, or something like that. A very small bunch of WASP, would you call it, lobbied for military privileges. I'd love to have had the GI Bill. I'd have gotten a jet rating as fast as I could and a few things like that. But we were not.
And did that... you were very excited to go in and help the war effort. Was there any feeling of being pushed aside, or were you upset at the way the end happened?
I would say very much so.
Yeah, I agree.
Was there any recourse? Did anyone try to make sure that you stayed involved? Was there ever any thought of that? It was basically a cut and dry thing at the end.
Yes, exactly.
And how did the rest of the pilots that you were working with feel about that?
Well, I think some of them thought it was, I don't really know, but I think some of them thought it was very unfair the way the WASP disbandment went ahead, but there was nothing could be done.
Did the program ever get revived in any form that you're aware of?
Nope.
And never really any plans to revive a program like that, because now we do have female pilots in the military, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, you have them in combat even today. I think it's optional if they try out or request combat training, but I think if they're qualified, they're allowed to do almost everything.
Do you feel like you were pioneers, or did you just at the time feel like you were doing a job that needed to be done? Because in reality, I'm sure that the women pilots of today would look back on the WASP program as a pioneering effort for women in the military.
Well, I go to some of the reunions, or there's a big organization, I don't know if you've been to, Ruth, it's called Women in Aviation, and they get together every year. It's a huge bunch of women in every branch of aviation, and they treat the few WASP who manage to attend like royalty. We're all getting on in years, and so anybody who's 70 or 75 today and says they were in a WASP in the WASP program is not telling the truth, because you had to be 21, I think, minimum in my day, maybe.
Right.
So everybody's either passed away or we're dropping like flies. And
Well, that's why we're here, to talk about it.
There are very few left, right?
I think there are something like, out of 1,000 total WASPs, or these are kind of round figures, there's something like 350 left alive. And some of them are not physically able to travel or go to a reunion. And I think some have no interest in it, but most still love to see their old classmates and tell stories together. And
Now, you were in the whole atmosphere of the military and the war. After that December 20th, 1944 end of the WASP program, did you have trouble readjusting to civilian life? Did you find you were really ready to do things and they kind of cut you off? I mean, we talked to a number of the male veterans, and a number of them had trouble readjusting. They had been in combat, however. So did you have that same readjustment issue, or was it maybe easier for you?
well, a great many of the WASPs either were about to be married or got married during the program, and so they started having families and raising babies, and that took a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And it was almost impossible for a woman to get a pilot's job. I know, because a small bunch of us wanted to stay in aviation. In fact, not such a small bunch. I think a lot of the WASP wanted to stay in aviation, and very few were able to get jobs. I started flying for non-scheduled airlines, and I can still remember I was being paid $3 an hour, and I loved my job, and and the pilot I flew with would be getting $5 an hour. So the prices sound pretty funny today comparing.
Well, and the difference would be 80% difference in pay. That must have had an effect on the psyche of the WASP after you left the program. You did all of this effort for the war, you put all this effort into the war effort, and then after the end of it, it almost seems, in retrospect, and I'm speaking from not having been there, like you were just, thanks for your help, see you later, and that doesn't seem fair. Did you feel that way?
No, I don't think. Huh? I think we were.
Well, the only thing was, remember, we had trouble with, I've forgotten what you call it, but you know, with the financial status of what we were on, which you felt like you were just kind of tossed aside and goodbye.
It's true.
I'm sure that the women in today's military look back and thank you for that. And you mentioned at reunions you get that. What sort of response do you get from women pilots that are in the military today? Do they ask you questions? Are they afraid to talk to you? Or
oh, anything but afraid. At least my feeling has been, I don't know, I've probably been to more of the reunions,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I haven't.
But I've kept up my interest in aviation. And these women that are in the military today, they just treat us beautifully. In fact, they want our autographs, and we have a booth in the exhibit hall at these big conventions, and they really feel that the WASP program broke the path for what they're doing today. Of course, we look at what they're doing today and think that's terrific.
Yeah. Now, you just mentioned you've stayed active in aviation. Ruth, have you also remained active as a pilot?
No, I haven't.
When was the last time that you were actively flying?
Actively flying? Well, when I left the WASPs. I didn't fly after that.
Really? Did you have a desire to? You had mentioned earlier you didn't really like flying when you started.
I liked flying all right, but I wasn't eager to continue with it.
But you were, Betty.
I was, and actually both of us had husbands who were pilots.
Right.
And so my husband was a salesman, and he had to travel all over, and after we got married and moved to Aspen, I remember the very first trip after we were married, Art had a baby blue Cadillac and used to be gone 2 or 3 weeks at a time and then come back here and spend some time in Aspen between trips. But I didn't like driving. I still don't today. That's stayed constant. And I had 2 airplanes when we got married. One was not such, well, I thought it was a wonderful airplane. It's in the Air and Space Museum today.
The actual plane?
I gave it to them. I loaned it for a while, and they don't like loans, so it's on donation.
What kind of plane was that?
A P-39 Air Cobra, little fighter plane that I just adored. But anyway.
You said you had a second one as well.
The second one was a Navion, which wasn't a very good airplane. In fact, it was terrible here in the mountains. It didn't have any power at all, and hardly. One day we tried to go to Gunnison, which isn't that far, and we couldn't get over the hills to Gunnison. We had to come back and land. But anyway, my husband had flown the hump during the war.
Which is Burma?
China, Burma, India theater, and he did that for quite some time. And he was also training, I remember he trained a lot of Chinese cadets, which was interesting because most of them didn't speak English. And he had some experiences too. But after we got married, the very first trip, we put the suitcases in the car and we started to drive past the Aspen airport. And gosh, this is 60 years ago, I guess, or 50 years ago. Anyway, it's a long time. And I asked him where he was going, and he said, well, we're going to wherever it was, Wichita or something that was about an 8 or 10 hour flight with a couple of fuel stops. I said, well, I forgot to tell you, I don't like driving, and my airplane's sitting right here, and I think we should take it. And everything was in my favor. There wasn't one cloud between here and Wichita, and Art was open-minded enough to say he'd try it, and it took something like, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours nonstop. It was a lot easier, and that got him back into flying again.
Now, had you met your husbands during the war or before or after? When did that happen, since they were also pilots? Ruth?
I knew my husband. We grew up together in Denver, but he had married somebody else and had raised a family. And so I really didn't see much of him in those immediate days, but then after the war is when we got together again. And he had divorced his wife, and then he and I got married.
When was that?
In 1947.
And for those in the Aspen area, it was Darcy Brown was your husband.
Yeah.
I worked for him in
You
the
did?
70s, yeah. And I always appreciated the fact that he waited in line just like everyone else for a hamburger at the sun deck. Anyway, and Betty, when did you know Art before or during the war, or was it afterwards?
Afterwards.
Mm-hmm. And you said that he was flying in the war. Did flying become the way you met, or what brought you to Aspen?
Well, somebody had told my parents that this one airplane I had was very dangerous, and they were getting upset about my flying it anymore. And then I got a job, because it was so hard to get a flying job, at Saks Fifth Avenue and in the ski shop. And it was the first year that Aspen opened. The first lift, I think it was 1946.
46 in
something
December,
like that.
yeah.
And I would ask all these ladies that I was zipping into their fancy new ski outfits, and I'd say, where are you going? And about 2 out of 3 said, oh, we're going to Aspen, Colorado. And
this was in New York?
In
at
New
Saks
York.
Fifth Avenue, huh?
I didn't work there very long. I was one of those Christmas sales ladies, but at least we could wear ski clothes when we worked, as opposed to everywhere else in the shop. They had to wear their little black dresses and their pearls. And
Did you already ski?
yes, I had skied quite a bit when I was at Bennington College, and I'd been to South America with the Dartmouth ski team, and I skied very fast. I was never a good skier, but I went like hell.
Which in racing is the key, right? So you met Art?
I met him here in the lift line. He and a friend of his. Do you want this story?
Sure.
I think I'm talking too much.
Go ahead.
They were It was only two lifts. I guess we had lift 1 and then midway and then lift 2. And lift 1, everybody would be in line to go up the lift.
And it was a single chair.
And it was a single chair. And he and a friend of his were wearing little cardboard signs around their neck that day. And it said, "We are the 2281 Club, and if you think we're attractive, we are available." And I thought they were both kind of attractive, but one a little more, that was art, a little more than the other. And the 2281 was his phone number, because we only had 4 digits in the phone those days in Aspen. He was building a house here. So that's how we met.
A sign around his neck.
Really true, but it took us about 6 years of casual dating and skiing together and partying together to decide to get married.
Now, flying-wise, you've continued to fly, as you said. Do you still fly?
No, I gave up my helicopter, which was the true love of my aviation experience, and I don't know, 15 years ago probably. I'm absolutely certain that you have to fly a lot or it isn't safe to be a pilot.
How true.
It was also getting very expensive.
As I think everything is. For those in the future, 2008 was expensive. They'll probably laugh at that. Did the experience in the WASPs, in the WASP program, change your attitude about, and I'll throw these words out, did it change it about war? I know you were in the United States, but certainly you must have been touched by what was going on overseas. Ruth? Did it change your attitude about war, or did you really just do a job and not think about it too much?
I didn't think about it too much.
Did it change your attitude? Or did you have an attitude to change?
I was too busy to even think about it, I guess.
Which, amazingly, is the answer we get a lot from the veterans. Did it change your attitude about anything, really? About America, about other countries, about society?
Not really.
No?
I'd agree.
Yeah. What would be the most memorable thing you took away from the WASP program, would you think? Feeling of accomplishment, disappointment that it was over? When you look back at those times...
Both of the above, I would say.
When you look back at those times, what jumps out at you from that time in your life? Any one thing?
Well, my brother was killed when I was in the middle of WASP training. He was a Navy pilot and flying off a carrier. He was 21 years old. And the catapult failed to work and the ship ran over them. And so that had a very personal consequence. My family had a big conference and decided I could continue my flight. I was right in the middle of my basic training when that happened. But that colored my life.
But not so much directly from the WASP program as the war itself.
Exactly. But a great many of the WASP were married when they went in the WASP, and some got married during the WASP program. And a lot of their husbands were killed overseas. I say a lot, but for a small group such as ours, it had a definite... One of my baymates was killed. I roomed with a Chinese girl. There were 2 Chinese women, I think, in the program. And her name was Hazel Lee, and she was a very, very close friend during WASP days. And she was up at Romulus, Michigan, I think, and coming into land, and another plane landed on top of her or something. It was pretty traumatic.
Now, since the WASP experience, what organizations, you had mentioned, Betty, earlier, that you go to some of the reunions, the 99s is another group. Is that a women's pilot group, am I correct?
Yes, it's a huge group. Certainly the biggest group of women pilots today are members of the 99s. I think it's 5,000 or 6,000 women all over the world. They have chapters in India.
And were you a charter member of that group, or
no, heavens no.
How long has that been going on? Because you were a member, am I correct?
Well, I've just kept up my membership. I pay a very minimal dues, and I don't go to any of their meetings because I wouldn't. There's a chapter or 2 of them in Denver and Colorado Springs, but I don't know any of those ladies.
How many are in the 99, do you know?
I'm guessing around 5,000 or something.
Oh, Lord, it is large.
And the WASP is the only program that I'm aware of where we're losing members all the time with no replacements, obviously, as we die off, where the 99s, any 16-year-old or 18-year-old with a pilot's license can join the 99s. And they have women pilots of all ages. I don't know what the minimum age is today. I think it's 18, might be 16.
Uh-huh.
Up to that.
I don't know. I've never
They
kept
have
track of it.
They have women in their 70s or 80s who would be in the minority. Most of them are probably in their 40s and 50s and actively flying today.
Mm-hmm. Before you finished flying, how many hours would you say you had?
I'm not sure, Mark. I stopped keeping a logbook after a while, but I think I had up in the thousands anyway.
Did you ever want to fly commercially once you got out of the WASP program? You had mentioned you were co-piloting for $3 an hour.
Oh yes, I'd have flown. I couldn't get on a scheduled airline. In fact, there's a woman in Denver who I think was one of the very earliest women pilots on airline pilots. I've forgotten her name right now, but I can't think of her name. But I would have welcomed a job in United Airlines' right seat. I would have thought that was wonderful, but it wasn't happening. I was lucky to get a job on this non-scheduled airline.
How long did you do that?
As long as I could find work.
Let's talk about Aspen for a few minutes, if we can. When did you come to Aspen for the first time?
1945.
45. Is that when you moved here?
Yeah,
So you've lived in Aspen since then?
all the way.
Even before the first lift?
That's right.
This is a question that can probably take hours and hours to answer, but what would you consider the biggest changes in Aspen since you've been here? And again, I realize that's such an open-ended question. Besides the real estate prices, what would you consider some of the biggest changes you've seen here?
Well, just the obvious, the big change is that when I first knew it, it started out as a little mining camp, as it were, and has grown into a metropolis, traffic-wise, building-wise, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, I'm going to assume you ski or have skied.
I have skied.
Do you ski at this point?
No, I don't.
Was that something that was a big part of your life? Obviously, your husband being the CEO of the ski corps.
It was,
Then the ski company.
obviously. I wasn't a great skier, but I enjoyed skiing and skied a lot for fun.
And in Aspen, do you think Aspen remains a ski town, or do you think it's become something else?
I think it's become something else. I think it's a glitter pad.
Do you like that?
No,
What are your feelings, Betty? I mean, you've been here, you moved here right after the war as well?
Full-time in 54.
54.
And
Quite a bit different from then till now.
I go along with Ruthie's answers too. It's just become so fashionable as a ski resort that it's changed a lot of the life for those of us who live here full-time. Consider this home. It's very, very different. And there's a lot of changes, and there are a few things I think are good, but I hate a lot of the new architecture and what they've done to the downtown area, and they seem to be destroying even more of the landscape every time I look around.
When Aspen started naming runs and cutting runs, one of them is now named Ruthie's Run,
right?
and you are the Ruthie.
That's right.
How did that come about? And were you happy about it, or?
Just because I offered to pay for it.
So you had to pay for your own run. And your husband was the CEO. That doesn't seem quite fair.
No, I've offered. I thought that we needed another way off the mountain other than what they had, because they were Roach Run was a little more difficult than I cared about, and then the next thing was, because that was a race run, and the trails that they had at that point cut off of Aspen Mountain were really not for the not, I'm not going to say beginners, but intermediate skiers.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that we needed something that was more intermediate and pleasant to come down. Well, that was my idea, and I went to Walter Pepke and suggested the idea and said that I'd be willing to finance it to a degree to get it started. And he agreed also. He wasn't a skier, but he knew the thought. And so they proceeded to cut Ruthie's Run, and then he insisted that it be called Ruthie's Run. And I'll never forget the day that it opened for the first time. It was a snowy, blizzardy day, and I had to open it for them, help them open it. So we went to the top of the mountain and stood in there freezing to death, waiting for this great big opening. And finally, when it came, I had to just lead off the troop coming down the mountain, and people like Fred Island and those Stein Erikson, those big skiers were behind me coming down the mountain. Well, as I told you, I wasn't a real fast skier or good skier, but just intermediate. So they had to plow their way down the mountain with me. So officially open Ruthie's Run.
And was the skiing good that day?
Was it good that
Yeah.
day? It was terrible. It was, I mean, it was deep powder and blizzardy conditions. Wasn't good in my line anyway.
How much did it cost? How much did a run cost back then? Do you remember? I'm assuming it was just for the clearing of the run, the timber and brush.
Right. I'd say somewhere around 9,000.
Uh-huh. In skiing, in your skiing career here, Betty, are there any particular times or events that stick out in your mind?
Not really.
Now, you live at the base of Tyhack.
Mm-hmm.
Were you living there before Buttermilk opened?
Yes, when we got married, our first house was over near the Castle Creek Bridge, and then we were building the house that we live in today. We've been in it over 50 years. And that's about.
Since it was before Buttermilk opened, did you and your husband have a hand in opening Buttermilk?
Very much so. My husband and Friedel Pfeiffer had some adjoining land, and we felt that Little Nell was okay, but it was enough to terrify most beginning adults and quite a few children even, and that we needed more of a beginner's area, beginner and intermediate area. Aspen skiing was getting to be very fashionable and very popular. So Friedel and Art got together, and I think it was the same year that Highlands opened. I'm not sure, but I think so.
I believe it was,
Could be,
58.
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they started Buttermilk. And all I can remember is we had I'm trying to think of the name of it, a restaurant that was a hyperbout. I won't even try on that one. But anyway, it was very unusual. And Friedel and Art had one of their frequent disagreements about whether to keep Buttermilk open for Thanksgiving that year. I think it was the second year it was open, maybe the first. And all I can remember is Art got his way for once. Friedel was pretty hard-headed too. They would disagree on quite a few things. They were unlikely partners, I think. But at any rate, I still remember we had 3 little girls at that point, and we took the kids and put them in the airplane and went to Wisconsin to see Art's family at Thanksgiving. Art having won the argument here about shutting down buttermilk because there wouldn't be enough business to warrant keeping it open. And so I remember Art had a cast on his leg because his mom's house only had 1 telephone and it was downstairs, and we'd all just gone to bed. And the phone rang, I don't know what time it was, 9 or 10 at night, but his mom called and said, "It's for you, Art." And he said, "Oh, I can't come downstairs again with this cast on." It was very steep stairs. And she said, "You know, they say it's really important. It's a very super important phone call." And we had all 3 kids with us, and what else could be very important, I thought. But I remember, of course, I, being so curious, went downstairs with Art, and he was clumping away with his cast. And I heard him say, "Jesus Christ, Friedel, really? Oh my gosh." And it went on like that for a couple of minutes. What, the whole damn thing went? And the whole place had blown up. The whole restaurant had and if there had been skiers there, it could have been very disastrous. But we felt it was a good thing Art had won that argument, and nobody, I mean, all the equipment was out in the parking lot, and so.
And that was that original restaurant with kind of the parabolic roof, or
paraboloid or something.
Yeah,
that's what I was trying to say.
We've got some photos at the Society. Now, speaking of photos, one more thing. Obviously, at some point, the Ski Corps, I believe it was the Ski Corps at that point, became the ski company later, bought buttermilk. So you two must have gotten to know each other a bit at that point, or at least your husbands were working together. What was the dynamic at that point in town? The ski company being the big corporation, buttermilk being kind of the new upstart. Was that how it was? That's how it's perceived in historical memory. Is that how you remember it?
No, I remember buttermilk as being a great teaching area.
Which it still is.
And as opposed to Little Nell was the only other option at that point. And Highlands was a separate company too. And then you probably know more of ski company history than I do. But I don't know when it became where you could buy a lift pass that was good on all 4 lifts was relatively recently, wasn't it? First, for quite a while, it was buttermilk and Aspen Mountain.
I've really forgotten.
Yeah, I've forgotten all the...
I think originally there were separate companies, and then
they merged.
The ski company bought the buttermilk, and merged, and ultimately it's all 4 now. One other thing I wanted to ask you about before we look at these photos is people in Aspen today may not be aware, but the Maroon Creek Club is, you've got a pretty strong connection to that, at least historically. Is that right?
Well, we sold a lot of our ranch to the people that developed the golf course at Maroon Creek. And my husband loved to play golf. I never been a golfer. I took it up once and took a few lessons and didn't like anything about it. But anyway, that was part of our ranch for a long time.
Now, you brought in a couple of photos, and I wanted to just hold them up, and we'll probably get better shots later. But this is you, Ruth, I assume?
No, that was
or
me.
Is this you? Okay. Now, do you remember when this was taken?
It was during the WASP. We all had our new uniforms, and everybody, I think it was taken at Wilmington, Delaware, or I'm not sure. It was in a scrapbook that somebody...
And then this one is also you in front of...
an airplane, just somebody's plane here at the Aspen Airport. It was taken for some story written about me. I don't know. It's not my plane. But it was posed that way.
And is there anything else you'd like to add, keeping in mind, again, that there'll be people in the future looking at this, trying to get a sense of not just the war, but in this particular case, the WASP program. Have we skipped something that you'd like to add about that time that you can think of? Again, picturing someone looking at this in 50 years, trying to get a feel, a sense of how important and what the WASP program was like. I think you've given us a good feel, but is there anything you can think of, humorous memories or anything else that would kind of round out the description?
You got anything, Betty?
No, I think I've been doing most of the talking here.
No, I don't think there's anything in particular.
Well, I have a couple of our buttons that we want to give from the Roaring Fork Veterans History Project.
Oh,
Wear with pride, if you will.
thank
Or,
you.
or stow away with pride.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you around campus, as they say.
Good.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you,
you
Betty.
very
Thank
much.
you, Ruth.
Thank you.
You bet.